She had walked these glass and stone corridors 100 times before, but never like this. Never with rain hammering the conservatory roof like a punishment from the sky itself. Never with her silver gown soaked through and clinging to the heavy curve of her belly. Never with the quiet, terrible feeling that something sacred was about to be taken from her. Her name was Melanie Dodson, and she had grown up with nothing. No title, no bloodline worth mentioning, no pack that claimed her as their own. She had been an omega in every sense the world used to diminish a woman, overlooked, undervalued, passed between foster dens like a problem no one wanted to solve permanently. But then Gilbert Corr had looked at her across a crowded gala hall, and for the first time in her 24 years of living, she had felt like something worth keeping. She pressed her back against the cold stone base of the weeping angel statue, its mossy wings arching above her head like a shield that could not actually protect her from anything. The iron gate beside her was slick with rainfall, the bars glistening in the blue-gray dark. She had only stepped out here for air. The gala inside was suffocating. Too much perfume, too much gold-threaded laughter, too many elders watching her from across the room with expressions she had never been able to read correctly. She had needed 5 minutes of cold and quiet. She had needed to breathe. She had not meant to hear anything at all, but the conservatory's inner gazebo was only separated from her by 30 feet of rain-pooled stone and one ancient iron gate left carelessly ajar, and Gilbert's voice, low and controlled as a drawn blade, carried farther than he knew. She could see him from where she stood frozen, his back to her, broad and unyielding beneath that heavy fur-lined black cloak that made him look less like a man and more like a monument. He stood the way he always stood, like the room had been built to accommodate him, like gravity itself bent slightly in his direction. The single lantern on the ground beside him threw orange light up the stone columns, casting long shadows across the two figures facing him. Elder Bradley stood on the left, squat and deliberate, wrapped in gold-trimmed black robes that had always reminded Melanie of burial clothes dressed up for a celebration. Beside him, Elder Thorne, taller, thinner, with the patient stillness of something that had been waiting a very long time to feed, leaned over an ancient ledger resting on the stone altar between them. His pale fingers moved across the open page the way a merchant's fingers move across an inventory list, checking, confirming, tallying. She watched Elder Bradley tap the page with one blunt finger. She heard him say, clearly, without shame, "The girl and the child she carries. The council requires confirmation that the terms remain unchanged." She stopped breathing. Gilbert did not turn around, did not flinch, did not hesitate in the way a man hesitates when he is about to say something that costs him. He simply answered the way a king answers a question about logistics, about borders, about the price of grain in a distant territory. "The girl and the brat are the council's now. The debt is settled." 4 words beyond that. She heard 4 more words, and then her mind stopped recording language and began recording only sensation. The cold bite of rain on her bare arms, the way the lantern light made the elder's gold trim glitter like something obscene, the weight of her own stomach beneath both her hands, where she had pressed them without realizing, the way a person presses against a wound. 5 months. She was 5 months along. She had cried when she found out. Good tears, overwhelmed tears, the kind that come when something you were afraid to hope for actually arrived. Gilbert had held her face in both his hands and told her she had given him the only thing a king could never acquire through conquest. She had believed him. She had believed him so completely that she had already begun in the quiet of her own heart to call the baby by a name. And now those same walls that had felt like the first real home she had ever known were rearranging themselves around her into something else entirely. Not a palace, a cage of glass, always watched, always calculated, always waiting for the moment her value could be converted into something more useful than her actual presence. The elders murmured, pages turned. Gilbert's cloak shifted as he moved to sign whatever was being laid before him. Melanie did not scream. She did not collapse against the weeping angel statue behind her, though every muscle in her body was asking her to. She did not call out his name. She did not give herself away with so much as a breath. She simply stood in the cold blue dark on her side of the iron gate, on her side of the world he had allowed her to believe she shared with him, and felt the entire architecture of her life come apart, quietly, completely, and with a kind of efficiency that suggested it had never been as solid as she thought. Then her legs remembered something her heart had not yet caught up to. Run. And so she ran. If this story already has your heart pounding, you are exactly where you belong. This pack sees you. Drop a comment right now and tell us, did you see that betrayal coming, or did it hit you like it hit Melanie? Subscribe, turn on your notifications, and share this with someone who needs a story that doesn't flinch. Because what comes next will change everything you think you know about Gilbert Core. We are just getting started. She had not always known what it felt like to be chosen. Growing up the way she had, shuffled between pack dens that tolerated her presence the way a household tolerates a graft, fed and housed but never truly held, Melanie had developed a very precise internal measurement for the difference between being kept and being wanted. Being kept meant a roof and a reason. Being wanted meant someone looked at you when you weren't performing anything, when you were just standing still in an ordinary moment, and they looked anyway. They looked because you were worth looking at for no other reason than the simple fact of you. Gilbert Core had looked at her that way exactly once before the night of the gala, and it had undone 5 years of careful emotional architecture in approximately 4 seconds. But the gala was the night it became something she could no longer explain away. The great hall of Veyrath Manor had been transformed for the occasion. Every arch draped in winter white and deep obsidian silk, every candle burning in iron holders that lined the walls like sentinels dressed for ceremony. The political council held their seasonal convening twice a year, and twice a year the Alpha King was expected to appear before them in a display of cooperative power that everyone in the room understood was not cooperation at all, but a very elegant, very expensive form of submission. Gilbert hated it. Melanie had learned to read that particular hatred in the set of his jaw, in the way his silver blue eyes moved across a room full of elders with the controlled patience of a man who had spent years learning not to show his hand. She had been standing near the far window when he found her, dressed in the plain dark green she had chosen herself because she had not yet understood what kind of night this was going to be. The city sprawled gray and rain-slicked below the manor glass, and she had been watching it the way she often watched things she didn't belong to, with a kind of wistful, practiced distance. She heard him approach before she saw him. Not his footsteps. Gilbert moved without sound when he chose to, but the shift in the room's attention, the way a crowd subtly reorients when someone important changes direction. She turned, and he was already there. Closer than she expected, one hand extended toward her with something folded over his forearm. Silver. It caught the candlelight and held it, turning it into something liquid and alive. "You were wearing the wrong color," he said, and his voice in that low, private register he saved for moments that weren't meant for anyone else was enough to make her forget, briefly, that there were 200 people in the room watching them. "I had this made. I had it made for you specifically, Melanie. I want you to wear it tonight." She had looked at the gown and then back at him, trying to find the angle, the strategy, the political calculation behind the gesture, because she had grown up learning that gifts from powerful people were usually invoices dressed in pretty wrapping. But his face had held something that she could not, even with all her training in self-protection, translate into anything other than sincerity. She had taken the gown. She had come back wearing it 20 minutes later and watched his expression do something it rarely did in public, soften, completely and without apology for just a moment, before discipline reassembled itself across his features. He placed her hand on his arm and walked her into the center of that room like she was the only fixed point in it. She remembered Elder Bradley watching from across the hall, one thick hand wrapped around a goblet of something dark, his small eyes moving over her the way an assessor's eyes move over property. She had noticed it and dismissed it because Gilbert was beside her, and Gilbert's presence was, at the time, enough to make almost anything feel manageable. She did not know that Elder Bradley had already begun referring to her in his private correspondence with the other council members, not as the Alpha King's chosen, but as the settlement piece. She did not know that the gown itself had been cataloged in a ledger she would not see for another 4 months, listed under an entry titled Asset Presentation Costs, written in Elder Thorne's thin, meticulous hand. She only knew that for the first time in her life, a room full of important people watched her move through it, and she did not feel like she was trespassing. She held on to that feeling. She held on to it the way you hold on to things you have waited your whole life to feel. Too tightly, maybe. Tightly enough that you stop checking whether the ground beneath it is solid. The binding ceremony happened 3 weeks later, in the stone grove behind Veyrath Manor, where the old oaks grew so thick and close together that even full moonlight arrived filtered, broken into silver fragments across the moss and root. It was not yet the full mating bond. That was a thing of permanency, of biology and soul, something Gilbert had told her quietly that he wanted to approach with the kind of deliberateness it deserved. The preliminary ritual was older than the pact structure itself, a declaration of intent sealed in shared blood and witnessed vow, and it meant, in every tradition Melanie had ever been taught, that a choice had been made, that a person had been claimed not as property but as people, irreversibly, at the level of something sacred. She had stood barefoot in the grove with her hair unbound because that was the custom, wearing a simple white shift that the night air moved through like cold water. Gilbert stood across from her in the circle of lit stones, and he was, for the only time she could recall, without his cloak, without the armor of rank and ceremony, just the man, broad-shouldered and serious-eyed, holding a ceremonial blade across both palms with the careful reverence of someone who understood what they were about to do. The elder who officiated was Elder Marin, one of the few council members Melanie had never felt watched by, one of the few who had ever spoken to her as though she were someone with opinions worth hearing. Elder Marin spoke the old words in the old tongue, and the grove seemed to lean in slightly, the way living things respond to frequencies they recognize. When Gilbert drew the blade lightly across his palm and held his bleeding hand out to her, he looked at her, not past her, not through her, not at the political result of her, and said quietly enough that only she could hear beneath the formal words, "I mean this, Melanie. Whatever else you ever believe about me, believe this." She pressed her cut palm to his. She felt it immediately, a warmth that moved up her arm and settled somewhere behind her sternum, something that felt less like a beginning and more like a recognition, like two things finding each other that had always been pointed in the same direction. She had cried. She hadn't planned to, but the tears arrived before she could make any decisions about them, quiet and helpless and real. Gilbert's jaw tightened in the way it did when he was holding something in. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, the only concession he allowed himself in front of the formal witness. She did not look up at the balconies. She would not have been able to see clearly anyway, through the blur of moonlight and her own overwhelmed tears, but they were there. Elder Bradley and Elder Thorne, positioned along the upper stone railing of the manor's rear terrace with the stillness of men who had arrived early to secure the best view of something they had paid for. Bradley had his arms folded across his chest, his expression the quiet satisfaction of an investor watching a long-term asset perform on schedule. Thorne had a small leather-bound notebook. He was writing in it. "The preliminary bond," he wrote, "has been established. The asset's emotional investment is confirmed and complete. Extraction risk is now minimal." Below them in the grove, Melanie Dodson pressed her bleeding hand against the Alpha King's and felt, for the first and last truly uncomplicated time in her life, that she had finally arrived somewhere she was meant to be. She did not take anything with her when she ran. There was no time for anything, and no version of this night in which pausing to pack a bag did not end with someone finding her before she cleared the manor grounds. She moved on pure animal instinct, the omega survival reflex that the political classes had spent generations trying to breed out of her kind, precisely because it worked, and that instinct said river. The manor's east garden ran all the way to the bank of the Vey, a fast black stretch of water that the estate used as a natural boundary on that side of the property. In fair weather, it was picturesque. In a storm like this one, with 3 days of rainfall behind it and the current running at twice its usual speed, it was extremely dangerous for a human being. Melanie was not precisely a human being. She hit the bank at a full run, her silver gown dragging behind her through the mud and the flattened wet grass, and she did not stop at the edge. She went over it without breaking stride, and the cold swallowed her so completely and so immediately that for one full second her entire nervous system simply went silent with shock. Then the current grabbed her, and she let it, going limp in the way you must go limp when something stronger than you has you in its grip. Fighting it was how people drowned, and she had no intention of drowning tonight, not with 5 months of life depending on her making it to the other bank. She made it. She pulled herself out of the water on the far side, gasping, her hands slipping on the mud and the river grass, and lay face down for exactly 4 seconds before she got back up. Her legs were shaking. The cold had reached a depth in her bones that she knew would matter later, would demand accounting, but later was not now, and now required movement. She reached inside the bodice of her gown, still there, still sealed in the small wax paper envelope she had carried for reasons she had not been able to fully articulate even to herself, some low animal instinct keeping it close like a last resort, and drew out the suppressant pouch. It was an herbal preparation she had learned from an old Omega midwife in the 3rd foster den, the kind of knowledge that got passed hand to hand between women who understood that sometimes the only power you have is the power to disappear. Crushed wolfsbane root, white ash bark, and 3 other things whose names she had memorized but never expected to need. She rubbed it into her pulse points, wrists, throat, the insides of her elbows, and felt her own scent close off like a door quietly swinging shut. To Gilbert's trackers, she would simply cease to exist in the air. No trail, no direction, nothing. She straightened in the dark and the rain with her soaked silver gown hanging heavy around her and the manor's lights still glowing on the far bank like something she had briefly, catastrophically mistaken for a home. Then she walked into the dark and did not look back. 5 years had a way of changing the texture of things without changing their fundamental shape. She was still Melanie. She was still someone who felt too much, who absorbed the emotional weather of a room the way exposed stone absorbs rain, deeply and all the way through. She still woke sometimes at 2 in the morning with her hand pressed flat against the left side of her chest, feeling for the warmth that once lived there and now lived somewhere between memory and phantom sensation. The preliminary bond didn't break cleanly, even with time and distance. It faded to something bearable, the way a fracture line in old pottery fades. Still visible if you look, still the place where the object is most likely to give under pressure. But she was also now other things. She was Melanie who knew every shortcut between her apartment building and the diner, who could carry 4 plates without a tray and remember 6 orders without writing them down, who knew which of the overnight regulars needed their coffee before they said a word, and which of the kitchen staff were having hard weeks and needed someone to notice without making a production of it. Her empathy, that raw, undisciplined Omega gift that had once been her greatest vulnerability, had been sanded down over 5 years of human world living into something more precise and more useful. She didn't absorb so much as she read. She read rooms and people the way other women read weather, quickly and with the kind of accuracy that comes from needing to be right. The city was called Heron, and it rained here with the same gray consistency it rained everywhere she seemed to end up, as if the sky had made a personal decision about her. It was a mid-sized human city with enough people to get lost in and enough industry to keep a woman with no verifiable pack history employed without too many questions. She had built a life here out of practical materials, a 2-room apartment on the 4th floor of a building whose elevator worked about 60% of the time, a job at a diner called Caraway's that smelled permanently of coffee and onions, and a son who was, at 4 years old, the single most extraordinary and terrifying thing that had ever happened to her. Caleb. He had Gilbert's eyes. She had known he would, had steeled herself during the pregnancy, and then been completely unprepared for it anyway the first moment she held him and looked down and found those silver-blue irises looking back at her with a focus that newborns were not supposed to possess. He had her dark hair and her bone structure, and what she is increasingly convinced was her ability to feel everything in a room simultaneously. But he had his father's eyes, and his father's fundamental quality of taking up space in a way that made other people rearrange themselves. He was 4 years old, and he had made every window in their apartment vibrate 3 separate times. The first time it happened, she had assumed an external cause, a truck on the street below, a tremor in the building's old infrastructure, and had gone to check the windows and found nothing, and filed it away uneasily. The second time she had been watching him. He had been sitting on the kitchen floor with his toy animals arranged in a very specific pattern that he would not let her disturb, and I had accidentally knocked one over while stepping past him, and the look on his face before the windows began to tremble was the look of a person discovering that they are angrier than they knew how to be. The trembling lasted 6 seconds. The toy I had knocked over floated just slightly, barely an inch off the floor, before settling back down. I sat down on the kitchen tiles across from him and breathed very carefully for a moment. "Caleb?" I said, the way you speak to a very small person who is also, it turns out, something unprecedented. He looked at me with his father's eyes and said with the absolute seriousness of a 4-year-old reporting a fully formed internal experience, "Like the floor wanted to listen to me." I pulled him into my lap and held him tightly and stared at the wall and thought, we are running out of time. The third incident happened on a Tuesday. The same Tuesday that a man she recognized walked into Caraway's diner at 11:40 in the evening and sat down in the last booth by the window. She had her back to the door when he came in, refilling the coffee of a long-haul driver at the counter who came in every other week and always ordered the same thing and never asked her anything personal, which she appreciated. She heard the bell above the door. She heard the particular quality of silence that moved through the diner like a pressure change, the kind of silence that happens when something significant has just entered a space, and the space knows it even if the people in it don't yet. She turned around. He was already in the booth. He had not come in wearing the black fur-lined cloak. Of course he hadn't. He was in a human city. He was not completely without tactical sense. But he wore a long, dark coat that sat on his shoulders with the same authority the cloak had always carried, as if the garment itself understood who was wearing it and adjusted accordingly. His hair was shorter than she remembered, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. His jaw was the same. His posture was the same. His left hand, she noticed immediately, was pressed flat against his side in the way a person presses against something they are trying to contain. He was bleeding. She knew it before she could see evidence of it. She smelled it, faintly, through the suppressants she no longer needed to use as heavily in this city, but still applied out of habit. The familiar iron and cold night scent of him underneath something darker and more urgent. Silver, she registered. Silver-contaminated blood. The wound was not healing the way a normal werewolf injury would have healed. He looked up from the table and found her across the diner with his eyes, with the immediate, unerring accuracy of someone who had never quite lost track of where she was. She did not drop the coffee pot. She gave herself credit for that. She set it down on the counter with the careful deliberateness of a person managing a very strong and complicated emotional response, and she stood for a moment looking at him across the length of the diner, past the long-haul driver, past the 2 young women sharing a plate of fries in the middle booth, past the counter and the glass display of pies she had stopped actually seeing months ago. And she had approximately 4 seconds to decide what she was going to do before the professional habit of her body made the decision for her, and she began walking toward him the way she walked toward any customer who was clearly in need of something. She stopped at the edge of his table. She did not sit down. "You need to tell me how you found me," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect, "before I decide whether or not I'm calling anyone." He looked up at her. He looked at her the way he had once looked at her across a gala hall and across a moonlit grove, with a specificity that had always undone her, and she felt the ghost of the preliminary bond stir somewhere behind her sternum like an ember someone had just breathed on, and she hated it and was not surprised by it, and neither of those things changed anything. "I'm not here to take you back," he said. His voice was the same, lower, maybe, worn at the edges. "I'm here because if I don't tell you what's coming, You won't be able to protect him." "Don't," she said, quietly, fiercely. "Melanie." He moved his hand slightly from his side, and she saw the dark spread of it through his shirt, the silver-contaminated wound that was already 2 hours old by her estimate, which meant it was not healing at all. A silver bullet, placed with precision by someone who knew exactly what they were targeting. The windows of the diner were not vibrating. Caleb was upstairs in the apartment, 4 floors above, asleep under the supervision of her neighbor, Mrs. Adaora, who knew Melanie worked late and asked no questions. The windows of the diner were not vibrating yet. "You have about 40 minutes before his advance team reaches this block, possibly less. They tracked me here. I led them here because I needed to find you first, and I needed them to think they were following me on their own terms." He exhaled, and the effort of it showed in his jaw. In the controlled way he absorbed the pain of the silver working its way through his system. "There is a safe house on Cordon Street, 14 minutes from here on foot. I need you to trust me for 14 minutes, Melanie. That's all I'm asking." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the conservatory, the rain on the glass, the lantern light on the elder's gold trim. The girl and the brat are the councils now. She thought about Caleb 4 floors up, with his silver blue eyes and his ability to make floors listen to him. She thought about the 40 minutes Gilbert had just given her, and the 41 minutes in which she no longer had the luxury of deciding this from a place of safety. "You're going to explain everything," she said, quietly, fiercely. "You're going to explain everything, all of it, every word of that night." "Yes," he said. "And if your explanation isn't enough, then you walk away again, and I won't stop you. I couldn't stop you if I wanted to. I'm not sure I could stand up right now without help." She looked at the blood soaking through his coat. She looked at the door. She looked at the ceiling, as if she could see through it to the 4th floor where her son was sleeping. She pulled her apron off, folded it once out of pure muscle memory, and set it on the table. 14 minutes, she said. "Walk." The safe house on Cordon Street was a narrow, unremarkable thing wedged between a laundromat and a shuttered electronics repair shop, the kind of building that human cities produced in abundance, functional, forgettable, designed by its very plainness to be looked past. Inside, it smelled of damp plaster and old wood, and faintly of the specific herbal compounds that told Melanie's nose that other wolves had sheltered here before, that this place had been prepared and maintained by someone who understood what prepared and maintained actually meant in the context of council pursuit. She got Gilbert through the door and onto the low couch against the far wall, and then stood over him with her arms folded while he breathed through the silver burn with the controlled, meticulous discipline of a man who had clearly been doing it for hours already. "Talk," she said, "now, before anything else." He looked up at her. In the thin, yellowish light of the single working lamp, he looked older than the diner had suggested, not broken, but worn in the way that long, sustained effort wears a person, the way carrying something heavy over a great distance marks the body differently than a single moment of catastrophic weight. There were shadows under his eyes that belonged to sleeplessness rather than the wound. He had been awake, she realized, for a very long time, possibly for years, in the way that certain kinds of effort require a person to remain in a permanent alertness. "The document I signed that night," he began, without preamble, without the kind of careful relational scaffolding that a man trying to soften a blow constructs first. He said it directly because she had asked for directness, and because he owed her that much at minimum. It was not a bill of sale. It was a tracker-linked contract, a legal instrument that our intelligence division spent 14 months designing specifically to map the council's offshore transaction networks. Every clause in it was a coded geographic marker. The moment Bradley and Thorne countersigned it, they activated a chain of documentation that began logging every illegal transfer, every territorial exchange, every slave trade route they had been running under diplomatic immunity for 30 years. Melanie did not move. She absorbed this the way she had learned to absorb things that required very careful processing, without expression, without immediate response, giving the information space to settle before she decided what to do with it. "The words you heard me say were scripted. Bradley and Thorne needed to hear me confirm the terms in language they had chosen. If I had varied from their phrasing, they would have known something was wrong. I had been working toward that moment for 2 years, Melanie. 2 years of allowing them to believe I was cooperative, financially desperate, willing to trade a personal relationship to settle a territorial debt. 2 years of letting them think they had leverage over me. He paused. I did not know you were in the conservatory. I did not know you would hear it, and by the time I realized you were gone, the contract had already been activated, and pulling it back would have meant destroying the only evidence that could dismantle the council from the inside. So you let me run, she said. I searched for you for 8 months, he said, and something moved through his voice on those words, something that had been very precisely contained, and now, in the particular exhaustion of this particular night, slightly less contained than usual. 8 months with the trackers. You were gone completely. The suppressant. I didn't know you had it. I didn't know to look for its absence. A pause. Eventually, I had to accept that you had chosen to disappear, and that pursuing you further while the council was still watching my every movement would only lead them to you. So I stopped, officially. I stopped, and I finished what I had started, and I took apart every financial structure they had built, every route, every transaction, all of it. And then 3 weeks ago, when I finally moved to dissolve the council entirely and present the evidence to the High Tribunal, Bradley and Thorne authorized Vane. They decided to liquidate the asset, Melanie said, and hated the way the words sat in her mouth, hated that she was using their language, hated that she understood immediately what it meant. They decided that you and Caleb, alive and outside my protection, were the most efficient way to destabilize my credibility at the tribunal. A king who lost his pregnant mate, whose child was raised in hiding. The narrative writes itself from their perspective. And a child with your blood and mine, with whatever Caleb is becoming. He stopped. They cannot afford for that child to reach maturity. He represents something the purity doctrine was specifically designed to prevent. She had known, on some low frequency, that this conversation would eventually arrive at Caleb. She had been braced for it since the diner, but hearing it said plainly, hearing that her son was not a complication in this story, but a central target of it, moved through her differently than bracing for it had prepared her for it. "There's something else," Gilbert said. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has been carrying the heaviest piece of information and has arrived at the moment when he is no longer able to justify the weight of carrying it alone. "The council had your parents killed, Melanie. Your mother and father. The house fire when you were 3 years old. It wasn't accidental. There are records in the transaction network. Your mother was the last surviving heir of the Ashvale line, a royal bloodline the council spent decades suppressing because a living Ashvale heir would have the legal standing under old law to challenge their authority directly. They put you in the foster system because a child without a name and without a history cannot make a legal claim to anything." He exhaled. "You were never an Omega without lineage. You were the most dangerous woman in the pack world, and they spent your entire life making sure you didn't know it." The room was very quiet. Melanie sat down, not because she chose to, but because her legs made the decision independently, lowering her onto the wooden chair across from him with a kind of slow inevitability. And she sat, and she looked at the wall, and she let the information move through her in waves, the way grief and rage and the particular vertigo of having your entire personal history restructured arrives, not all at once, but in layers, each one revealing something that recontextualizes everything beneath it. She had spent her whole life believing she was someone the world had simply misplaced, an accident of circumstance, a body in the wrong rooms. And the truth was that every room she had been put in had been deliberately chosen. Every disadvantage, every resource withheld, every foster den that looked at her and found her insufficient, all of it architecture, all of it intentional. All of it designed to keep an Ashvale heir from ever standing up straight enough to understand what she was standing on. She did not cry. She had spent her tears in a glass conservatory 5 years ago, and what lived in her now on the other side of this information was not grief, but something harder and far more purposeful. "Where is Vane right now?" she asked. Gilbert's expression shifted, a subtle recalibration, the recognition of something in her voice that he had not heard before, or perhaps had not heard in this particular form. 12 minutes out at most. He'll have the building covered on 3 sides. "Then we have 11 minutes, Melanie said, "and we are going to need Caleb." They came in through the laundromat wall. It was a professional entry, calculated, coordinated, the work of people who did this with enough regularity that it had become procedural rather than urgent. 4 of them through the collapsed partition, 2 more through the safehouse door simultaneously, and Commander Vane himself appearing in the narrow hallway beyond the couch with the unhurried authority of a man who had already decided how this was going to end. He was tall in the specific way that Enforcer-class wolves were tall, built for impact rather than elegance, wearing the Council's deep gray tactical uniform without insignia because the Council officially did not have an enforcement arm and Commander Vane officially did not exist. His eyes moved across the room with professional efficiency, logging bodies and threat levels, and settled on Melanie with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite indifference, but something precisely between the two. "The asset and the child will come with me," he said. "The king can remain. What's left of him." What happened next happened faster than it should have, given that Gilbert was running on a partially healed silver wound and had not slept in what Melanie's assessment suggested was approximately 36 hours. He came off the couch with the ferocity of something that had been conserving itself specifically for this moment. Not the controlled authority of a king in a formal context, but something rawer and older. The animal fury of a man who had lost everything once and had arrived at the precise location where he was being asked to lose it again and had decided with complete and uncomplicated clarity that he would not. He took the first 2 operatives before they had completed their repositioning. The third caught him across the wounded side, and he absorbed it and kept moving, the way glaciers move, unstoppable not through speed, but through a quality of absolute commitment to direction. Melanie did not watch him fight. She was already doing something else. The Omega empathy that she had spent 5 years refining into a precision instrument opened in her like a door blown inward by pressure. Not the soft, receptive version she used in the diner to read her regulars, but something wider and more forceful, reaching outward into the room and finding every nervous system in it simultaneously. She felt the operatives' fear beneath their training, and there was fear. There was always fear under the professional surface, the body's honest response to violence, regardless of which side of it you were standing on, and she did not absorb it this time. She reflected it. She gathered it from all 6 of them and redirected it back, amplified, a psychic resonance that hit them all at the same moment, like a wave hitting a wall. 3 of them stumbled. 1 went to his knees, overwhelmed by a sudden, sourless terror that his training had not prepared him for, because nothing in the Council's operational manual accounted for an Ashvale heir using her bloodline's gift offensively. The 4th pressed his hands against his temples with an involuntary sound. Commander Vane was more disciplined. He staggered but did not fall, and his eyes found Melanie across the room with a new expression, not contempt now, not indifference, but the focused recalibration of a man updating a threat assessment in real time. He reached into his coat. The windows of the safe house began to vibrate. Melanie felt it before she heard it, a low building resonance in the glass and the walls and the floor itself, a frequency that was not her and not Gilbert, but was unmistakably theirs, an inheritance of both of them working in combination. She turned toward the door that led to the safe house's back stairwell, which she had left open, because she had asked Mrs. Adaora to bring Caleb here if she heard anything that sounded like things were going wrong. And Mrs. Adaora, who had not survived 67 years in Heron by being inattentive to the sound of things going wrong, had clearly made that judgment call approximately 4 minutes ago. Caleb stood in the doorway in his pajamas with the owl print that he had specifically requested because he had decided owls were serious animals that deserved representation in textile form. He was 4 years old, and he was barefoot, and he was looking at Commander Vane with his father's silver blue eyes and the particular focused stillness of a child who has not yet been taught to be afraid of his own power. The vibration became a sound. Vane raised the weapon. The sound became everything. They returned to the Packlands 3 days later because Melanie had sat in the safe house in the aftermath of Vane's retreat. He had retreated, they all had retreated, had been driven back by something none of them had operational language for, and Melanie had looked at her son sleeping against Gilbert's uninjured shoulder and understood, with the complete and exhausted clarity that arrives on the other side of a threshold moment, that running was no longer a viable architecture for her son's life. Caleb deserved to know what he was. He deserved to grow up in the full knowledge of his lineage, both sides of it, without the shape of his power being something he encountered alone in ordinary apartments with no context and no guidance. And the council, what remained of the council, Bradley and Thorne and their remaining adherents, would keep sending vein-shaped things until there was nothing left to send them at. You could not run from a system, you had to dismantle it.
"The altar of the old law," Melanie said to Gilbert on the morning of the second day, while Caleb slept. "The purity doctrine can only be formally challenged there. Old law supersedes council statute, which means if we stand at the altar with documented evidence of Ashvale lineage and the tracker-linked evidence, Bradley cannot dismiss it as a king's unilateral claim. It becomes a matter of constitutional pack law." Gilbert looked at her for a moment. "You've been reading." "I've had 5 years. I read a lot." Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same general territory. "The eclipse window is in 4 days. Old law challenges must be presented under open sky during a lunar event where they require a full council quorum, and we are not convening a quorum of people who want us dead." "4 days," she said. "Then we move in 4 days." The altar of the old law sat in the center of the stone grove behind Veyroth Manor, which had a specific and terrible poetry to it that Melanie did not allow herself to dwell on as they walked toward it through the eclipse dark, with Caleb's hand in hers and Gilbert moving at her other shoulder. And behind them, the 23 pack members who came when Gilbert sent word, quietly, through channels the council did not monitor, to people who had been waiting for years for someone to send word. Elder Bradley was already there. He knew they were coming, of course he had. Bradley had spent 40 years surviving in a political structure built on anticipating other people's moves, and he anticipated this one. He stood at the altar with 12 council loyalists flanking him and Elder Thorne at his right hand, and he looked at Melanie as she walked out of the tree line and into the eclipse light with an expression that had finally dropped all pretense of calculation and arrived at something simpler and uglier. "This is not a legal proceeding," Bradley said. "This is a fugitive returning to the jurisdiction of her legal designation. The asset and the child will come to council custody, and the Alpha King will answer for 37 counts of breach." "Present the contracts," Melanie said. She did not raise her voice. She had learned over 5 years of human city living that a voice that does not need to be raised carries farther and lands harder than one that does. "Present every contract that references me or my son by name, and I will present the Ashville documentation and the tracker-linked evidence, and we will let the altar decide what old law says about the legality of any contract that involves the sale of a royal bloodline heir." Bradley's expression shifted. "Seize them, execute the king for breach, take the child." The loyalists moved. Gilbert moved first.
He fought the way Melanie had watched him fight in the safe house, with total commitment and without the governance of pride, without any performance of dominance, just the raw and focused effort of a man who had decided exactly what he was fighting for and found that decision sufficient to override everything else, including the silver wound that had only partially healed and the sleeplessness and the accumulated weight of 5 years of long-game maneuvering. He was not fighting like a king. He was fighting like a father. And that distinction, Melanie was discovering, mattered enormously in terms of what a person was willing to absorb and keep moving through. She opened her empathy wide, wider than she had in the safe house, wider than she had ever allowed it to go, because this was the altar, and she was Ashvale, and this was precisely what the bloodline gift had been built for. This specific moment of a system trying to consume what it had no right to consume. She felt every person in the grove, ally and loyalist and elder, and she pushed, outward and upward, a psychic resonance that shook the air like a second eclipse was descending. Elder Bradley, to his credit, was still standing, still moving toward Gilbert with something in his hand, the formal execution instrument that old law permitted a presiding elder to carry, a silver-edged ceremonial blade that was also very practically a weapon. "Breach of contract is punishable by dissolution," Bradley said, and raised the blade. And Caleb, who had been standing at the edge of the altar stone with his hand pressed flat against its surface, the way he pressed his hand flat against apartment walls when he wanted to feel the building listening, opened his eyes. The sound arrived first. Then the light. It came from the boy and through the boy, and was not quite either of those things. It was the specific frequency of something very old and very decided expressing itself through a small child in owl print pajamas, a primal resonance that the old prophecies had described in language that scholars had spent centuries arguing was metaphorical. It was not metaphorical. It moved through the grove like a tide through a closed room, finding every surface and every person simultaneously, and where it touched the council loyalists, it did not harm them, but it stopped them completely. The way an absolute truth stops an argument, not through force, but through the simple, overwhelming evidence of its own nature. The conservatory glass in the manor behind them, every pane of it shattered outward in a single simultaneous exhale. Elder Bradley dropped the blade. Elder Thorne sat down on the ground with the sudden graceless movement of a man whose legs have made a unilateral decision. The grove was silent except for the rain, which had started again, because it always rained when something in Melanie's life reached a moment of reckoning, and she had long since stopped being surprised by this. Caleb turned to look at her. He had been crying. She could see the tracks of it on his face, though she didn't think he knew he had been. His expression was the expression of a child who has just discovered the full dimensions of something he had only known the edges of, overwhelmed and very young, and fundamentally, essentially, himself. "Mama," he said. The floor was listening. She crossed the altar stone and knelt in front of him and held his face in both her hands, the way Gilbert had once held her face in the gala hall, and said, "I know, baby, I know." So was everything else. The dissolution of the political council took 6 weeks in formal proceedings before the High Tribunal, and was neither clean nor simple, because dismantling a 40-year institutional structure never is. There were loyalists who contested, documentation that required authentication, PAC members who had operated within the council's framework for so long that the framework's absence left them without bearings. There were hard conversations and harder decisions, and at least 3 occasions on which Melanie sat across a formal table with people who had once cataloged her in a ledger and held the ground of her own personhood with the steady, deliberate force of someone who now knew exactly what ground she was standing on. The Ashvale lineage was formally recognized at the 5th session of the tribunal proceedings. The clerk read it into the record with the neutral efficiency of someone whose job required equanimity in the face of historically significant moments. And Melanie sat and listened to her own name attached to a bloodline the council had spent 30 years trying to erase, and felt something settle in her that she had not known was unsettled. Some deep, structural thing. The question that gets asked at the very beginning of a person's life and sometimes does not get answered until much later. Who are you? And do you belong anywhere?
She belonged. She had always belonged. The belonging had simply been hidden from her by people who understood that a woman who knows her own worth is very difficult to put a price on. On the evening that the last council loyalist formally surrendered their commission and the PAC lands passed into a governance framework that Gilbert and Melanie had spent 3 weeks arguing about and revising and arguing about again with the specific productive intensity of 2 people who respected each other enough to disagree precisely and at length, on that evening, Melanie stood at the window of Veyrath Manor. Not the conservatory, the upper study, which had a wide window facing east, where the city lights of the human settlement beyond the tree line were visible on clear nights as a warm scatter of gold against the dark. Heron. She could not actually see it from here, but she knew the direction of it, and she looked that direction for a moment with the particular regard you give to a place that held you when nothing else would. Caleb was asleep in the room 2 doors down that he had immediately and non-negotiably designated as his on the grounds that it had a window seat wide enough to lie across and look at the sky, which he considered a non-negotiable architectural requirement. He had adjusted to the Packlands with the adaptability of a 4-year-old who had already lived more than most 4-year-olds are asked to live, making opinions known about everything from dinner to the color of his bedding, and the Pack had adjusted to him with the slightly dazzled reverence of people who had witnessed the primal resonance and were still, weeks later, metabolizing what it meant. She heard Gilbert come into the room behind her. She did not turn around. "The Eastern Territory representatives want a formal audience next week," he said. "The border adjustment agreement needs a co-signatory from the Ashvale line if it's going to carry constitutional weight, which means you." "I know," she said. He came to stand beside her at the window, not close enough to presume, not distant enough to perform separation. He stood the way he had learned over these 6 weeks to stand in her presence, present and available and without demand, the posture of a man who understood that he was not owed proximity and was choosing to remain anyway and hoping, without pressure, that the choice would eventually be reciprocated. "I need to say something to you," she said, still looking out the window. "Yes?" "If we do this, if I stay, if I stand at that altar officially and accept what the Ashvale documentation means and sign the governance framework with you, it cannot be what it was. I will not be decorative. I will not be managed. Every decision that affects this pack or these lands or our son will be made with full transparency, and if at any point I find that transparency failing, you walk," he said, "and I don't stop you, and I spend whatever time remains trying to deserve a different answer." She turned to look at him then. He looked back at her the way he had always looked at her in the moments that mattered, with the specificity that had undone her the first time, the quality of attention that meant you, exactly you, as you actually are. It had not changed. 5 years and an ocean of damage and a 4-year-old who could shatter conservatory glass, and it had not changed. Which she found simultaneously unfair, and underneath the unfairness, something that she would not yet name out loud but that had been warming the preliminary bond's ember for 6 weeks. The governance framework has a clause, the one we argued about for 4 hours on Tuesday. The transparency and equality provision, he said. If it's removed for any reason, for any political convenience, I will know, and I will act accordingly. It stays. It stays as long as I do, and if I am ever the reason it needs to be removed, then I should not be there either. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at him the way you look at something you have been carrying the shape of for a very long time, not with the naive, wide-open trust of the woman who had stood in the grove in a white shift with her bleeding hand pressed to his, but with the harder, more deliberate trust of a woman who had run and survived and raised something extraordinary and read enough old law to challenge a 40-year institution and won. A trust that had been earned the long way, the only way she had come to understand that trust which matters is ever actually built. Then we try. Outside the window, the packland stretched away into the eclipse dark, and somewhere in the east, the lights of Heron glowed warm and steady, and in the room 2 doors down, a little boy with silver blue eyes slept with his hand pressed flat against the wall, feeling the building breathe around him, belonging to it completely, as he had always been meant to belong to something, as they all had, underneath everything that had been done to convince them otherwise. The floor was listening. So was everything else.